In 1441, a ship left the coast of Portugal with a mission that would change the course of human history. Not a war, not a plague, a business decision. Portugal started the Atlantic slave trade. Before the British, before the Dutch, before the Spanish built their empires on stolen land, Portugal went first. And for 300 years, the world let them. Here is what they buried. In the early 1400s, West Africa was not a continent in chaos. It was a continent in full bloom. The Mali Empire had universities. The Jollof Kingdom had laws. Senegambian traders moved gold, salt, and cola across routes that stretched thousands of miles. Families lived in walled compounds. Griots memorized entire civilizations in their memory alone. Children grew up knowing exactly who they were. Then the ships arrived. 1441. A Portuguese explorer named Anteo Goncalves did not come to trade. He came to take. He captured 12 Africans on the Mauritanian coast and sailed them back to Lisbon as a gift to Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry was not horrified. He was delighted. He petitioned the Pope. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull, a legal document blessed by the Catholic Church, authorizing Portugal to reduce to perpetual slavery any people from Africa. The Catholic Church put God's signature on the slave trade, and Portugal used it like a license. By 1482, Portugal had built Elmina Castle on the Gold Coast of West Africa. Stone walls, iron bars, a door that opened directly onto the ocean. They called it the Door of No Return. Captives were marched through that door onto ships they would never leave alive. Elmina was not a prison built by criminals hiding from the law. It was built with royal funding, blessed by priests, and staffed by soldiers wearing the cross of Christ on their chests. The cross of Christ, on the ship that carried human beings into the Atlantic like cargo. Here is the number they do not teach in schools. Portugal transported an estimated 5.8 million African people across the Atlantic. 5.8 million. More than any other nation in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. Not Britain, not France. Portugal, the nation that invented the transatlantic slave trade, moved the most human beings across that ocean before the world finally said stop. And even when Britain abolished the trade in 1807, Portugal kept going, illegally, in secret, for another 50 years. The ships were called Nas. Inside the hold, enslaved men and women were chained in wooden berths barely wide enough to turn over. The crossing took between 5 and 12 weeks. On some ships, the mortality rate was 40%. 40%. For out of every 10 people loaded onto that ship never arrived. They were thrown overboard. Not buried, not mourned, recorded in the ledger as lost cargo. Lost cargo. That is what the Portuguese called human beings who died in the middle of the ocean. Brazil received the most. Between 1500 and 1888, roughly 4.9 million enslaved Africans were sent to Brazil alone. 4.9 million people. To cut sugarcane, to work gold mines, to build a colony that would make Portugal the wealthiest nation in Europe. By the 1600s, Lisbon was one of the richest cities on earth. Its cathedrals were gilded with Brazilian gold. Its merchants wore silk. Its kings lived in palaces that tourists still visit today. Every stone of those palaces was paid for with the labor of people who never consented, never profited, and never came home. And Portugal baptized all of them. Every single captive who passed through a Portuguese fort received a Christian name and a splash of holy water. They called it saving souls. What it actually did was erase identities. A man who had been Kofi became Joao. A woman who had been Adiz became Maria. In one ceremony, 1,000 years of ancestry were officially declared irrelevant. The Catholic Church did not protest. The Catholic Church participated. Here is what happened when the trade finally ended. In 1888, Brazil passed the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law. Slavery was abolished. No reparations. No land. No compensation. The men and women who had built Brazil's entire agricultural economy were freed with nothing. No back wages for centuries of forced labor. No acknowledgement of what had been taken. Just a piece of paper that said, "You are no longer property." And in Portugal, the country that started it all, there was no national reckoning, no apology, no monument to the enslaved. Instead, Portugal built a monument to the explorers. In Lisbon, right on the waterfront, there stands a massive concrete tower called the Monument to the Discoveries. It celebrates Henry the Navigator, The very man who received those first 12 kidnapped Africans as a gift. Portugal carved him in stone and pointed him toward the ocean. The ocean he used to build the largest slave trading empire the world had ever seen. Tourists take photos in front of it every single day. The descendants of those 5.8 million people are still here. In Brazil, 60% of the population has African ancestry tracing directly to the Portuguese trade. In Cape Verde, São Tomé, Mozambique, Angola, the scars are architectural, cultural, generational. Communities still live in poverty on land their ancestors were stolen from. Children in Bahia grow up in cities built with sugar money earned by their great-great-grandparents who were never paid. The Portuguese slave trade did not end in 1888. It changed shape. It became inequality. It became missing land titles. It became a continent drained of its people during its most productive centuries and then told to develop on its own. Here is the part that should make you pause. Portugal did not just move people. Portugal designed the system that everyone else copied. The British copied it. The Dutch copied it. The French copied it. Every feature of the Atlantic slave trade, the coastal forts, the triangular route, the plantation model, the legal ownership of human beings across ocean borders, was invented, tested, and perfected by Portugal. They were not one player in a global crime. They were the architects, and the architects have never been put on trial. No Portuguese leader has ever formally apologized. No reparations framework has ever been proposed. Elmina Castle, built by Portugal, still standing in Ghana, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Not a site of mourning, a tourist attraction. People walk through the door of no return for photographs. The door that once swallowed 5.8 million people stands open, lit by midday sun, listed in travel guides under must-see. This story was suppressed because it is too expensive to tell truthfully. An honest accounting would demand answers. Answers would demand responsibility. Responsibility would demand repair. And the nations built on this system have spent 5 centuries making sure that bill never arrives. But the bill exists. It has always existed. It is written in the faces of every descendant alive today. It is written in the wealth gap between the nations that sold and the nations that were sold from. It is written on the walls of Elmina Castle, in the grooves worn into the stone floor by millions of feet that passed through and never returned. They built their cathedrals. They named their ships after saints. They put the cross of Christ on the sails. And underneath it all, in the dark, in the hold, in the silence the history books skipped, 5.8 million people waited for a morning that never came. If this story stayed with you, share it. Not for the algorithm. Because somewhere right now, a descendant of those 5.8 million people does not know this story was suppressed. Sharing this is how that changes. If you are watching on YouTube, subscribe. This channel exists to find the stories powerful institutions spent centuries burying. Your subscription is what keeps that work alive. If you are on Facebook, follow the page and share this with one person who needs to see it. Every share is a refusal to let them be forgotten. The door closed on 5.8 million people. You have the power to open it back up.